Hello, everybody. Welcome to Emerging Minds podcast. My name is Gabriel Fairman, and today I have the pleasure of being here with Kate Elkins. Kate is a very experienced researcher, academic, very known in her field. Thank you so much, Kate, for being here with us. It's a pleasure, an honor, a privilege. And I would love to start off just if we can tell us a little bit about yourself, about your journey, and what you've been up to all these years.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. So I'm trained in comparative literature, and translation is a huge question for us, and been active in these debates about translation for several decades, really. And got into AI in 2016, rethought our curriculum here at Kenyon College, and created the world's first human-centered AI curriculum in 2016. Started working with AI and natural language processing, and some of my first work was modeling the shapes of stories. And we've actually done some pretty interesting things with translation as well with stories. And then in 2019, my collaborator, John Chun, and I were invited to be beta researchers with GPT-2. So that was back in early days when most people had not worked with it, and did a lot of work with GPT-2 and started publishing on that. And as we all know, now everybody knows what we do. So yeah, so it's been just a wild ride and a great ride, and lots of interesting things to talk about.
That's amazing. And is there any particular aspect of, because comparative literature, in my understanding, can be a pretty broad field with lots of different aspects. Is there a more central, not necessarily a thesis, but is there a more particular angle that kind of weaves your work together, or would you say it's depending on the actual research that you're conducting?
Yeah, so I started out working in philosophy and literature with a focus on memory and with cognition, and I still work on cognition and consciousness. So it's really a perfect segue into AI. In terms of translation, what has been really interesting, well, first of all, I work on Marcel Proust, and there have been lots of debates about early translations, which are classics, but maybe not really that close to the original. So translation has always been a huge issue with a lot of the authors that I work on. Same with Franz Kafka. There's a great book suggesting that the Kafka people read in different languages is actually a very different Kafka. And certainly some of the work that we've done suggests that that's the case. So in comparative literature more generally, there has been a really I would say almost heated and polarized debate about translation that you and the viewers may already be aware of, but I'll just review it here. And that is, as we read in translation, as we translate texts, are we reading radically different texts? Is translation ultimately creative, but also is it impossible? Are there aspects of the original that we cannot access when we translate? And so for many comparatists, one of the reasons why we work in comparative literature is because we read and teach the original, because there is this idea that there is an untranslatable aspect, right? And then, of course, some comparatists and teach world literature in which we're reading everything in translation, right? So the idea would be that we still can access some experience of reading Kafka and Tolstoy and Proust and all of these authors in English, that there are elements of that experience that are definitely translatable and that are worth reading in English, right? Even though we're not reading the original. So, this kind of translation debate has been active for a really, really long time. And what I love about working in the field of AI and natural language processing is we can begin to test these theories in a kind of applied way that I find very exciting.
And just curious, like when as far as your more, let's say, philosophical take on things, are you more in the camp where you also deconstruct the idea of an original even in its own language, or do you consider an original as an original? I'm not sure if I'm being super clear on my question, but do you go meta on the original, or do you treat the original text independent, I would say, from the reader, or do you think it's more of a symbiotic experience?
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying. Like, how much does the reader create that text? Yeah, that's a really great question. I think there are clearly very unique experiences that all of us bring, and also shared cultural experiences, depending on where we're from, that are really going to shape the way that we read a text. But I also think that there are aspects of text that are probably grounded in something, right? And the reason I say that, and what has led me to that belief, is my work on the shapes of stories, where we have found similar kinds of shapes in stories in different cultures, in different languages, across cultures, and there seem to be these kinds of universal shapes. And I say that, in fact, each story has its own completely unique shape, like a fingerprint, but they still have these waves of a language of emotion. So that has led me to believe that there is something in the language, in the narrative, that many of us are probably experiencing, that is a shared experience.
Got it. Yeah, it's it's almost like, maybe I'm wrong, but the way I'm understanding it, it's not a thing of either the literature itself versus the reader, but a body of shared experiences, a collective that we're all part of, I guess. But that's super interesting to me, because one of the things that I really like to focus on, and I'm by no means any kind of expert, but just someone curious. I really like to focus on the question of meaning and authorship, because first, in my life, I try to reinterpret things as often as I can, whether it's my emotions, my take on things. I try to understand how different points of view and different angles shape and create different meanings and eventually different outcomes. And then when it comes to generative AI, for instance, in my understanding at least, when I'm working with a generative tool, I'm not just I'm authoring, I'm dialogically co-authoring in a sense. I'm not just writing, I'm also reading. And how would you kind of define that? And also, what role does, or how much do you look at human agency as far as different roles and responsibilities in this, let's say, dialogical authoring process?
Yeah, that's really a great question. I mean, when you're interacting with generative AI, prompting still is a very powerful tool. And, the way that these generative AI tools work is they're most likely to give you the most predictable answer. And so in prompting, in dialoguing with it, the goal is to push it off the most probable, right? And to explore these other spaces of a different kind of style or tone or that kind of authorship, right? So, are you discovering it in the model? Are you pulling it out of the model? How much are you co-creating it? That's a great question. In terms of art and image generation, I think we're definitely much more in the creative zone. And the reason I would say that is because if you've tried Midjourney or any of these image generation tools, it's actually kind of hard to come up with something really cool that doesn't exist, right? And that's the goal. Like, let me think of something that doesn't exist and just create it with words. And I mean, it feels incredibly creative. The language models are a little trickier, because there I think we're really drawing on and pulling out these kinds of authors through prompting. So it definitely feels like a creative act. I can tell you that it's hard. Sam Altman said he's not even that good at it. There was a period, I don't know if they're still offering very, very large salaries for prompt engineers. So it's not non-trivial to do that, for sure. And a lot of that is understanding, pulling out these different kinds of language and almost like different kinds of authors, right, from the AI.
Yeah, I love the comparison between, let's say, working with more graphic oriented models versus with language, in the sense that it's what I'm understanding from what you're saying is that it's a little bit harder when you're working with language to depart from these previous bodies of work, whereas with images, maybe that it's a little bit more, I mean, it's very complex, but it's a little bit more possible to create things that aren't necessary, that haven't existed before. Is that kind of your definition of creativity? The ability to, does it kind of touch on this ability to generate something that wasn't previously there? Like, do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I am borrowing a little bit from Proust and, also the surrealists after him that are suggesting that creativity is putting two things together that normally you would not see together, and realizing that they can go together and seeing something new by putting those two things together. And that certainly you feel much more as a process when you're working with the image generation. The thing about authorship that I find really interesting, and this is just an anecdote from working with GPT-2, is some of our first work was fine-tuning GPT-2, and we did it on probably 50 different authors, and that included like Taylor Swift and, everything from philosophers to, all different kinds of writers, and testing how well GPT-2 could just continue writing in that style.
Mm-hmm.
We found that GPT-2, and that was a really small early model, right? Really, really limited, actually could do things that were very, very hard for my students. And I teach at Kenyon, very literary school. We have lots of writers, like really, really bright students. But I would typically ask them on an assignment to write like a particular author that we had been reading. So after we read Kafka, like write a passage and show, something that Kafka would write about in the style that Kafka would write in. I mean, I had students so frustrated by that because they could read Virginia Woolf or James Joyce or Kafka all day. But if you ask them, write a passage, like pretend you're Joyce, actually incredibly hard, right? This was so easy for GPT-2 to do, right, and capture thematics that my students might have missed, capture style. So, that has been really fascinating to me, that this aspect of capturing authorship, which for us may be kind of preconscious or unconscious and is very hard to tap into, is something that AI is actually very, very good at.
And that brings me, I guess, a question that I have for you. So I guess, translating to what I'm understanding, it's like you're describing AI as being very good at emulating a certain style or a certain discourse. At what point, if any, does that emulation become, in your understanding, conscious versus unconscious? Do you give much thought to that, or do you think that's something just too ineffable to touch on?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't even really know how to tell if humans are conscious, right?
True.
I think you're probably conscious, but all I really know is I am. At least I think I am. So, AI researchers most tend to say we cannot really know. So I do tend to bracket that kind of conversation. Where I do agree, however, is that we might want to think about using terms like intelligence for AI. And this gets into a whole hornet's nest where there are people on both sides. And many people feel we should not be using human terms. These are not human in any way. I think animals have intelligence. I think there are all kinds of intelligence. And I think we need to expand what we think of as intelligence beyond the human. And I think when we don't call AI intelligent, I think we are maybe not fully acknowledging both what is happening in front of us and the risks and the benefits and the craziness of it all, right?
I agree. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because I do see it as a double-edged sword, in the sense that with lots of people, when I refer to the idea of intelligence, it generates a lot of feeling of threat and intimidation and worry. And I've begun to refer more to what we do as an augmentation rather than an artificial intelligence, even though it's just different terms to call the same thing. But I notice that people feel more empowered with the idea of being augmented. And then you do have the risk of not realizing that what this Pandora's box could unfold into. But in your opinion, do you have an overall opinion on whether this is good or bad? Do you think it has no intrinsic moral or ethical value, and it's what we make of it? What are your feelings around all of this tech that's emerging?
Yeah. I think that people are, well, there's this whole debate, will human labor be replaced? Will there be all kinds of new jobs that we can't even imagine? And I think I'm not an economist and I can't predict. Certainly, I do think that it will. We have never before had intellectual and creative tasks be automated, right? So I do think that we've always had automation of physical labor, and that affected a certain group of people. But I think the intellectual class was not worried, and now we actually see intellectual automation, and that is, of course, worrying for white collar workers. So I think people are right to be worried. I think it's not in the near term. I think we're good for now. But I think, the stress should be a human in control all the time, because you've probably seen, I'm sure, hallucinations, confidence in things that are not true. You can see AI completely go off the rails. And I think it's particularly easy for us to use it 90 times well and then grow lazy and stop auditing and checking. And I think that's the most dangerous thing, right? When we begin to use it and grow confident in it, and how can we maintain attention when we grow accustomed? I think that's going to be a real risk.
I agree. If it's okay with you, can I share my screen for literally maybe a minute? I want to show you something and get your thoughts on it, because I think that by contextualizing, I'll be able to explain better this question. So in our understanding of how, let's say, to benefit the most out of the tech, I think follows a lot of what you've been describing, in the sense of there's a human agent that's in command and making the decisions. What we're trying to create is a scenario where, instead of prompt engineering, you're working very seamlessly with GPT and other engines. But the feeling is, we're trying to promote a feeling that is as natural as possible. So what you're seeing here in green is something that people refer to in our industry as translation memory. And previously, translation memory was something purely syntactical. So let's say, for instance, if this sentence said exactly the same sentence as something that was previously translated, that would be a 100% or 101% match, depending on the context. The blue is a machine translation feed that's coming from DeepL. And the yellow terms are terms that were either learned during the translation process or taught by the translator. But what's happening here is, with every single sentence, the translator is being provided with the most probable translation given all of this context. So we have some level of machine learning on our end that then sends over all of this context to GPT, that then arbitrates and decides on what should be the suggestion. And obviously the translator, they can always decide to change something. For instance, I'm going to change this to 2. So they can make their changes, their edits, and then confirm the segment. I guess my question is, in this kind of, and let me stop sharing now, but in this kind of environment, and one thing I did not share is that there's also a semantic verification of whether things are being translated in a way that makes sense or not. And in this kind of scenario, even if a human is just confirming and rereading and confirming, do you think that makes them the author of that work, or are they just a reviewer? Or at what point does reviewing end and authorship begin? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Certainly right now, for copyright law, at least in the US, you cannot copyright anything that you write using AI. And I think that is somewhat limited in the sense that it doesn't acknowledge the degree of work in prompting, right? In actually interacting. So here, I think there are certainly choices to be made with translating. And, in my world of comparative literature, translation is considered a creative act where the translator is in some ways a new author. So I think that having that human in the loop is definitely really important. I think it really comes into play with questions of localization that I know we haven't really talked about, right? So one of the really cool things about these newest AIs is the extent of linguistic, I'll call it dexterity, that they have, that depending on your prompt or hear the language that you're translating, you can end up in sort of different linguistic worlds, and that would be the level of formality and the level of creativity and expressiveness and all of these kinds of things. So the translator, in deciding that localization, right, say the American English is not very formal, but you're translating into Japanese, which has a completely different idea of formality.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You need to make sure that the AI doesn't stay in the informal Americanized version. Right. And then we have all of these culturally specific kinds of, word, different ideas, rain, if you're in India, is going to be viewed as a happy event, right? Et cetera. So I think that AI is getting quite good at that and quite good at localization, but I still would not depend on it without a human in the loop. And to that extent, we still have authors. Now, whether it gets so good someday that we really are just checking a box, but I think we're still a ways off.
Yeah, I understand, and I agree. I guess my follow-up question is, so in a prompt response kind of paradigm, I think there's a pretty clear separation that there's a human who's prompting and a machine who's responding.
Yeah.
But in what I just showed you, it gets a lot more interwoven because the prompts, they're not happening explicitly, they're happening in the background.
Right.
The suggestions, they're taking into account my previous choices as an author. So everything becomes kind of like this mesh. The AI said, let's say, maybe to translate house for home, but it was 2 sentences ago, I taught it that. I said that house should be home. So these feeds, they become really aligned to how I write. And exactly how you described, like this, we're leveraging that emulation capability, but trying to have it emulate the translator or author in this case. And I guess in this framework, how do you see that? Like, at what point? Because again, I totally get it that, like, from a copyright law perspective, if you prompt an engine and it gives you a response, it's not your work, at least for now. But I guess in this paradigm, more from like less from a legal perspective, more from like a sense of integrity and ownership perspective. Do you think it's possible for people to feel like they're owning that work, or do you think that is by definition or by inherently something that is in some way degrading to the sense of human creativity, authorship, and so on?
Well, maybe I wasn't clear. I actually think that copyright law is wrong, right?
Okay.
Because to prompt well is hard. Now, one day I'm not sure that will be the case, but for now, to write well is hard. And just to give you an example, we have students try to full Turnitin. So Turnitin is a plagiarism tool, right? And we had an entire class try to full write using GPT-4 and full Turnitin so that it thought it was human written. And only about 25% of the class could do it. Those who had the free ChatGPT, that was much harder because that's an earlier model. It's not nearly as performant. But, it was hard even for our best writer. You have to have that metacognition to know what a good result is and to work with it. And I would say the same thing with translation, that is requiring choices here. So I think, our copyright law and our way of understanding authorship is kind of back in these days of human versus machine. But it really doesn't take into account the extent to which all of us are usually making choices that are influenced by everything we've read. I mean, no one is operating in some kind of vacuum. And now machine is just part of that, right, background that we're using. So I certainly think that's, we're using decades old copyright law to work with something today, and it just doesn't fit. I would be very worried. There is this question, I guess I'll turn the tables on you. Like, why not go to Google Translate and just type it in, right? Like, what is it that this brings that's the value add? Because when I talk to language teachers at universities, they're saying all our students are using, or, they're translating, they're going to Google, right? They're not even necessarily doing it on their own. So what do you feel like is brought by somebody not doing it on their own? I mean, I know what I would say, but I'm curious what you would say.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my opinion, it's exactly what you described. It's there's this meta cognitive process of knowing what good looks like, and or what meaning looks like, and guiding the engine through that. So whereas, for instance, the big shift I'm seeing, especially with translators, like even with, let's say, using something like Google, it is what it is. You're going to translate a file and you're going to get it back. And sometimes it's going to be really good depending on the language pairs and the subject matter, and sometimes it may be kind of good, erratic at sometimes, but it's definitely not going to feel like you co-produced that translation. So then going back to fixing it, it's kind of a very, for most translators that I've known over my life, it's a very boring and tedious, and yeah, it's not a fun process, because you have to go back and try to make that your own, but it's already been pre-made in a certain way. So it's like I would say the analogy would be to redo a certain room with interior design, but not being able to talk to the designer, and then having to go back and being like, oh, but I don't like this, I don't like that. But the work has already all been done. So it gives you all this extra work to change that. Whereas working with this engine, because it's learning on the fly, it feels, at least to me when I use it, it feels like the work is mine, even though it's being co-produced through this engine, because the choices, the style, it's aligning to how I write. So I guess that's, to me, that's the big difference. But for a lot of people who don't, let's say, mind the fact that maybe it's not going to be aligned to their brand, or aligned to their style, or aligned to their terminology, maybe it's not, it adds no value. I think it begins to add value when customization and authorship are more of a thing. When it's, let's say, I just need to understand the gist of it, then I would say there is no added value. I think that the added value is being able to control really granularly the outcome of meaning.
I mean, from a technical standpoint, what you're saying makes sense, because one of the ways that the AI detectors work, and of course it's an arms race, so they're changing constantly as AI gets better at fooling them, right? And everybody's trying to figure it out. But with the earliest models, the way that they worked was looking for what is typically human. And one aspect of that is they call burstiness. So the easiest way to understand burstiness is when you think about this bell curve, this probability distribution, right? And you are prompting it to get it to fall somewhere on that. So, say you want something a little more sophisticated than average, you're going to be a little bit more out on that probability curve. But typically the AI is going to write, just like select always from that one place. Well, burstiness is the way that humans actually sample from all over that probability curve. So when I write, I use a lot of pretty generic language, but then I might use some kind of unusual words, right?
Mm-hmm.
Flaubert, is a perfect example of this, where, will look just totally generic, but then there'll be one word where you're like, wow, that's really kind of unusual, right? So that kind of burstiness right now, at least maybe not for long, is a really typical of human. And it strikes me that with your tool, the ability to move around on that sampling, is quite different from a typical AI generated translation, which is going to kind of pick a probability place and just sample from that. And everybody says, oh, you can tell AI generated text. Well, I think if it's done really well, I think it's hard to tell. But just kind of standard AI generated text, I think we're all beginning to kind of know what it looks like to some extent. And it is typically uniform, right? It's okay to have uniformity, but what I notice as a reader is that it's a little bit harder to pay attention, right? Because there's something about the burstiness of, for now, I'm sure they'll figure out how to do, they're already figuring out it, but those kinds of choices help us attend to the language better, I think.
Yeah, I love that. I just learned a new term. I didn't know the idea of burstiness. I always thought about it as far as temperature and stuff like that, but burstiness is such a good way to describe it. But going back to that example, and what fascinates me is that, let's say, through tech like ours, you're able to, a translator is capable of translating twice as fast, maybe 3 times as fast. But you don't notice, at least we don't notice, as far as like a general movement in our field, we don't notice a lot of adoption of tools like ours. There's still a fair bit of skepticism and fear, and a lot of it, I think, pertains to this characterization that you alluded to previously, which is this idea of machine versus human, and this machine being this foreign, otherly, threatening body. And at least to me, it's exactly how you described it, in the sense that I don't understand my mind as an individual entity, assuming that I'm conscious. I don't understand my mind as an individual entity. I understand my mind as this broader, it's immersed in this super complex linguistic social universe. And my thoughts, in my opinion, it's debatable as to what amount of them are my own versus just this mumbo jumbo that I create up here, maybe, similarly to a large language model in some degree. And so I don't feel threatened by this idea of working with this other engine, but there are a lot of people who do. Do you think there's anything that you've covered over your years that can be potentially reassuring for people to not look at this in such a threatening way? Or is this just human basic instinct of fearing the unknown?
Yeah. From a positive standpoint, what really intrigues me working with AI is, as I said, kind of testing our theories and figuring out how language works and how translation works. And this, I actually had a conversation at a cocktail party with translators, because it was for a special issue on translation. And somebody said, will translators still be around? And, I do think there is this belief in the craft of it, right? I question how many translators could truly be bilingual, not just in the languages, but in the cultures, to be a perfect translator, right? And probably, as you said, probably not the most popular idea, but what's been really fascinating to me about working with AI is that we're able to create these language maps, right, for each language. And this is a little anecdote that will show this, right, that actually with a lot of these large language models, instead of taking a very low resource language and then translating directly to another low resource, like everything goes through English, right? Well, to a lot of my colleagues, that's anathema, right? Why would you translate into English and then back from English? Well, part of it is that there is some ability to map these languages onto each other. And the way they do that is they create these mathematical vectors for each word. And it's in many, many dimensions, as many as 300 dimensional space. So that the word bank in one dimension might be with river, and in another dimension might be with money, right? And so both senses of that word is captured. Well, we can actually begin to put different languages mapping space-wise onto each other. And we can see which dimensions and which parts of the map are the same and which are different. So in this huge debate, are there elements of a language that are untranslatable? Or, is there some underlying kind of shared semantic space where we can move from one to the other? The answer is both. Like both groups who are arguing vehemently are right? Parts of certain languages don't exist in the semantic space of another language, and parts do, right? So as we're moving between parts of a language that are translatable, parts of a culture that are translatable easily, and parts that aren't, I'm sure, to be a great translator, there's a creative aspect. But if you want to be really faithful to these aspects of the translatable and the not translatable, as AI becomes more sophisticated, we actually have all of these linguistic worlds, right? And the AI is able to kind of map these spaces, and then when they don't exist, kind of give us suggestions for where to go. And to me, having that guide is invaluable, because I just think for a single human to understand, I think a good translator probably intuitively already has a lot of this, right? Preconscious, intuitive, but to have an additional guide which has actually mapped out all of these languages and can kind of see where they fit and they don't fit, that seems to me invaluable, right?
I would agree, but I think we share similar perspectives on that. I try to make myself understand like this different perspective, which is this idea of human as pure, and this this idea of machine impure, and like this almost this moral judgment, and another a key sense of, like, I think for many translators that I've known throughout my life, including my mother, I think it's been, there's this feeling of self-worth that comes from this, exactly the what you're describing, like this idea that in this language, in this context, only I can understand this, and only I can preserve the meaning of this. And maybe you're going to find another half a dozen people who know this as I do in both languages, but what I know is rare, it's valuable, and it's very, very difficult to achieve, because it takes maybe decades of training and learning to get there. But then, in my opinion, exactly how you described it, if you have this map, maybe you can shorten that time from decades to a few years. Maybe you can become more aware of different contexts. And I see this as an enhancement. But where do you think, like, at what point does this idea produce a fork in the road where you get people who fear it and resent it, and people who can appreciate this, let's say, enhanced human cognition? And is there something that's just the way it is, the way the human mind and society works? And do you think this was the case, for instance, with previous revolutions such as the agricultural or industrial one? Or do you think that this is a particularly thornier issue, and this won't be necessarily, we won't find some deeper kind of reconciliation with this idea of our own uniqueness?
ChatGPT was adopted more quickly than any other technology before it, right? So we do have resistance, but we also have adoption at an unprecedented rate. And I think, where you come down on some of these questions about the human is going to inform, how you feel about it. I think it's hard for me not to imagine. I think there will always be craft translators, right? And certainly it's the case that when you read Marcel Proust, in one of the first earliest translators, he actually is writing his own. I mean, it's him. It's not, it was originally titled Remembrance of Things Past, and that's from Shakespeare. This has nothing to do with the title, right? I mean, so, if we're dealing with a poem or a work of literature, you might have a craft translator, and you're reading that as much for that new author, right, as for the fidelity of the translation. But I think we've come a lot further to understanding, maybe in a problematic way, we're not really reading Proust when we're reading in that we're not really reading Kafka when we're reading in that translation. And I do think if you want to come closer to how those authors would feel, that AI is going to get us there. So it depends on what you want as an experience, right? Which one you're gonna argue for. The one thing that we haven't talked about that I would suggest would be interesting to think about is persuasion and emotion in translation. Because one of the things that has been really surprising to me in my work, looking at the shapes of stories, is that we thought that the shapes of stories were about action and a sequence of events. And that was a lot of the early work. And now we're actually finding that the shapes that we can surface using AI are a language of emotion. It's actually sentiment. It's not categorized. We don't know what emotion it is. It's just a positive or negative sentiment, right? And so that's these shapes. So we now know that stories may be working on us in ways that a good author maybe creates that shape. Maybe they know, maybe they kind of know. Kurt Vonnegut has a whole video about the shapes of stories. So clearly he knew this, right? But as readers, are we aware that we're on an emotional wave going up and down? Maybe not. And we're actually finding that language of emotion is everywhere. So we found it on Twitter. We found it in political speeches. We find it, all over the place. So, one thing that AI is very good at is effective AI. And this is particularly maybe a truth that people will be uncomfortable with, but something that we need to acknowledge. We already have instances of AI persuading people to do things, deceiving people, emotionally, right, kind of understanding and working on us. And to the extent that any translation is successful, the way it taps into a language of persuasion and emotion is really important. So if you're translating, a technical document, you can use Google Translate. You have to put together an IKEA piece of furniture, whatever, right? But if we're talking about creating text that is going to move a reader or viewer, whatever, AI can actually do this better than some human, right? Like we didn't really know those stories. I mean, Kurt Vonnegut knew, but most of us didn't know this language of emotion was even operating. And AI can surface it in an instant, right? So I would say that there I would trust an AI with a human to kind of tap into that level of language, and we're only now beginning to understand how that level of language works.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that I'm picking up on, and maybe I'm inferring too much, but one of the things that what you're saying makes me feel is that AI, in many ways, forces me to become a better reader, because as the more sophisticated I become at understanding what these words are doing to me, the more control I have over how I'm reading, how I'm interpreting, and then how I'm communicating back, how I'm writing, and how I'm acting with the world. So I see that as something positive in my opinion. But I do think that taps into maybe also one of the things that is least emphasized in education in general, which is this ability of individualized critical discernment. I mean, it seems like we're very mass oriented when it comes to thoughts, and we gravitate to camps and then stick to those camps as far as orientations go. Do you think there's any particular thing that individuals can do in order to enhance this feeling of readership and discernment, or is this just the way we're woven?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I do feel like working with prompting AI, when I use it with my students, it forces us to think about, why isn't the first response very good? And what didn't I tell it to do? And what mistake did I make? And that iterative process allows us to be thinking about those more subtle questions instead of just figuring out the basics. And, what I'm hearing you talk about with translation reminds me of the same thing. When I'm writing and I'm trying to figure out a really complicated idea and get my language persuasive and elegant, like my cognitive bandwidth is divided. And if I'm really struggling with the idea, then my language is usually less elegant. And then you have elegant language. And I hate to say I have students who write these beautiful papers, but they do. It's like beautifully written, but there's really no there, right? Because all of that effort was in that. And, translation, it strikes me, has the same issues, right? If you are spending a lot of your cognitive bandwidth just choosing a particular word, you're not paying as much attention to the overall feel and the effect and the emotion and the persuasiveness and the way that the words hang together. And so, it strikes me that once some of your bandwidth is less focused on just choosing each next word or each word, that you would be able to have that metacognitive process and kind of see the bigger picture. And that to me would be the advantage, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. I think that there's, in the sense that you can use this technology to access cognitive processes that were previously unavailable just because of lack of scarcity of mental bandwidth, it becomes something very empowering. And conversely, I would say that if you're using it without that in mind, and you're just kind of, let's say, forgetting your own ownership over what you confirm and what you prompt and what you change, then it can become a very disempowering force. And yeah, I mean, I completely see that in language as, if you become too focused on form, it's very easy to lose sight of function, and vice versa. And I see that opening up. And I do wonder, Kate, in like when it comes to emotions and persuasion, I agree with you 100%. But I would say, I don't have a firm stat on this, but I would say most content that gets translated in the world isn't anything in the realm of comparative literature. It's something,
Yeah.
it's a support article, it's a web page, it's
Right.
questionable literary value, maybe really well written, copywritten, but for a very specific context and a very specific purpose. It's a legal agreement and stuff like that. And in those kinds of scenarios, I would, in general, right, I would say that by definition, there's less leeway as far as authorship goes. Your goal is really to be as technical and precise as possible. Sure, you're going to change things around to fit that given culture, that given context, but you're rarely given the freedom to, like, as if you're trying, like in the examples you mentioned, for instance, if you're retranslating Dostoevsky or something like that, you have to have that degree of understanding of his body of work, the understanding of what Russian society looked back then, and what you're translating into. So it requires like and you have to be very free to rewrite that in a way that makes sense, towards, let's say, best trying to represent the author, and almost like re-embody the author in a way. Whereas in this kind of work, it is, in my opinion, more mechanical, less artistic by nature. And in this, but like you mentioned, I still do think that there is, in these subtleties, there is a huge amount of emotional persuasion still taking place. And I guess my question is, going more into details, in these subtleties, like, let's say, even in the example of the IKEA manual, in my opinion, depending on the word choice and the punctuations, and like, you could create very different kinds of emotions in a given reader. If you use a complicated word, all of a sudden that same manual that was meant to make people feel accessibility now makes it feel cumbersome. How do you think, like, even in technical text, do you still see emotion, or do you see emotion as something only present in more narrative bodies of work?
So I think for sure it can operate. I mean, I'm thinking more in terms of, ads and marketing. I mean, there for sure we're thinking about it. But I think that there is an aspect of persuasion that happens. So I remember, I'll give you an anecdote. I had a relative who was applying to business school, and he was writing his statement, of who he was. And, I said, it doesn't move you. It doesn't feel like a story. You have to move them. It's not about just saying who you are. It has to have an effect, right? So I think, whenever you're writing, you do need to think about the effect on the reader. And I would think about it, again, maybe machine translation can allow you to think about these larger issues. I would think about it in terms of pacing and rhythm, and where you are speeding up and where you are slowing your reader down. And, these are the kinds of things that you're unlikely to see necessarily with just a simple AI translated text. It's not taking into account the rhythm, which sentences you want them to move quickly through, where you want them to pause. And, just to give you, so certainly when I write, I am thinking about how fast I want my reader to move through the text, and I'm controlling that. And what really helped me understand that was, again, using AI to analyze successful texts. So this was a student who worked on this with me, and it never got published, but this is just a little anecdote, right? So we know that bestsellers have gotten easier and easier to read, and they've gone from, and I'm going to give you the wrong, your viewers can look it up, but 10th grade to 3rd grade, something like this, right? And so we can use AI, natural language processing, to determine the grade level, right? And I thought to myself, well, that's really interesting. Like, do bestsellers, are they all 3rd grade level, or do they actually vary? So we took Toni Morrison, who worked as an editor, and before she became a writer, and won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and incredibly subtle, complex writer. And we looked at one of her novels, and in fact, just like that burstiness that we already talked about, the opening chapter is like 2nd grade level, and then it gets up to 10, right? So she is actually controlling the journey of her reader, of where you have a very fast entry into the novel or into the content, and where you have your reader slow down. And I think that things like rhythm and pace, right? These are all aspects that control our reader's response to what we're writing. And again, like, if you're just focused on each next word and what it should be, you may not have the bandwidth to listen, right, to how this sounds, and to understand the pace and the rhythm and the kind of subtle emotional effects And I do think that using that is functions in kind of unconscious ways. The other thing I was going to say with that story about the essay is that we all respond if we feel like we know who the author is, right? There is this kind of notion of voice. So what I was trying to tell my relative is you got to feel like you can hear the voice on the end. And I definitely try to cultivate that voice. Now, do I actually think I have a particular voice? I mean, I have a bunch of different, I've written a bunch of different voices, right? It's not actually really there. AI can actually show us when we identify an author, it actually has nothing to do with what we would call voice. It has to do with how often we use the word the and a and like all these kinds of things, right? These little ticks that actually don't contribute at all to voice. Voice, I think, is a fiction, but when you feel like there's somebody on the other end of that, right? Writing that voice, you react to it differently. And so, and that's actually kind of hard to do. So what I would say, to you is like, that is a persuasive element. When you feel like somebody wrote that thing, when you can like feel that human and how we create that is actually a really interesting question. I know that I consciously cultivate that voices in different pieces that I'm writing, depending on the audience. But that is a persuasive thing.
I agree, and I think just in my personal experience, one of the things I realized as when I began not in translating, but actually writing with generative AI, I became a lot more appreciative of my own burstiness and erratic patterns and uniqueness in my voice. I began to see, okay, this isn't something I need to fix. This is something that's actually unique to me and that gives my writing some kind of flavor, some kind of emotional quality. And going into that, I do have one question. When it comes to translation, in your opinion, is there such a thing as accuracy that's purely textual, or do you think that the idea of accuracy includes or has to include that emotional response that's evoked through those words? So just to give you an example, like if I translate something and really change the meaning of maybe the words around semantically, but I'm able to evoke that exact same tempo, rhythm, and that more like visceral emotion in my reader, do you think that's accurate, or do you think that I have to do that within the constraints of the linguistic proposition?
I definitely think that they're better and worse. And to me, what you're really asking is a cultural one. I mean, you mentioned, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, right? And I myself haven't been to Brazil, but I know my collaborator lived in Brazil and he also lived in Japan. And he said you could not find two more different cultures in so many ways, right? In terms of expressive, all kinds of things, right? So to me, these are somewhat questions of localization. Would the best translation purely stick to that textual kind of idea, or would you modify the rhythm for an English speaker versus a Brazilian? Would you modify the cultural expressiveness of emotion for a Brazilian? I would guess that you would. I would guess that you need a stronger emotional signal for it to register. Like the baseline for the Brazilian is more emotional to begin with. So if you want a real peak, you're going to have to really accentuate that. So there's the textual, but then there are these cultural, right? Do I want it to feel like I'm reading Portuguese? The rhythm's going to be totally different, right? And it's going to feel foreign to me. Or do I want it to read whatever the equivalent of that rhythm would be, however unusual for American English?
Yeah.
And these are all kinds of questions. I mean, when you asked me, okay, so here's the worry, I think, with AI, right? When I tell my colleagues, they're just worried about getting these generic, homogenous essays that everybody's just going to push the button and produce these. I think the fear is kind of a pessimistic view of human nature, that you can tell me that there is a human in the loop who is making all of these choices, but all of us worry about the human who's just pushing the accept key, right? And that's the real fear. Like, I think that's the real fear of people. And when I describe my students who are iterating and really exploring how to get the most out of this tool, probably most of my colleagues are thinking, okay, but I'm worried about the students who are just going to give it a prompt and submit that essay, right? They're just going to push the button and accept the translation. So I think giving people confidence that the human is still in that role. And the problem is that I think that, again, as we grow to trust it and accept it, there's going to be more and more tendency to stop having that oversight and to just push the button. And how we maintain that vigilance and that attention, that's actually a very human task, right? It's like, once we really have self-driving cars, will we still be watching the road? Think about all the accidents where you kind of trusted enough that you stop attention. I think that is really going to be the task, right?
Yeah.
To prove that the way you're intervening in that translation is the best way, and that differential is huge.
I agree, and I'm super thankful, Kate, for all of your insights. It's been, for one, I've definitely become a bit more hopeful after talking to you. I think maybe it wasn't your intention, but I do see a lot of hope in the way you approach AI. And I'm fascinated because what I've learned so far from our conversation is that when you really look under the hood, when you examine, the more closely you examine language and the more, you really put it under the microscope, the more you realize that the dimensions of complexity that are there interwoven really make this much more as, let's say, an opportunity to just advance where we currently are than simply stop evolving. So that's something maybe I misinterpreted, but that's what I am taking away from our conversation. And I'm really grateful because I think it's a very powerful message. And thank you so much for your time and great conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Okay. Thank you very much for watching. And if you'd like this podcast, please remember to like and subscribe. Look forward to more. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.